A cane slipped on wet tile and an old man went down hard. His knee cracked against the floor. A metal tray flew from someone's hands and food scattered everywhere. For a second nobody moved. Then a dog came off the floor like a shot, a big gray Belgian Malinois, 90 pounds of muscle, teeth already showing. It crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped inches from the old man's face. The whole cafeteria froze. Nobody breathed. The soldier at the table jumped up, one hand out, ready to call the dog off before it tore into the stranger. But the dog didn't bite. It lowered its head. It pressed against the old man's leg and would not move. That man's name was Marcus Devereaux, and he had no idea who he was looking at. What did this old stranger know about him? Stay with me on this one. Marcus Devereaux sat in the corner of the VA cafeteria in Norfolk every Thursday. Same table, back to the wall, eyes on the door. Some habits don't retire when you do. He was 30 years old, built like a man who had carried heavy things for a living, and he ate alone by choice. On the floor beside his chair lay Ranger, a graying Belgian Malinois with a scar over one eye and hips that didn't work the way they used to. The dog was retired too. They had come home from the same war, and neither had figured out what to do with the quiet. People gave Marcus room. It wasn't the size of him. It was something in the face, the look of a man who had seen the worst day of a lot of people's lives and hadn't been able to look away. He was decorated. He had a shadow box at home full of ribbons and a folded flag he tried not to look at. If you asked him how he was doing, he'd say fine, and that would be the end of it. Here's the thing, though. He wasn't fine. 3 weeks earlier, he'd handed in his papers. After 12 years in the teams, 4 deployments, and enough funerals to fill a church, he was done. His body was breaking down. His sleep was gone. And there was a hole in him that no amount of duty had ever filled, a hole shaped like a man he'd never met. Because Marcus never knew his father. His whole life, all he had was a name. Chief Petty Officer Elias Devereaux, a Navy SEAL who died overseas on some operation the government wouldn't talk about. His mother had gotten a folded flag and a visit from 2 men in dress blues, and that was it. No details. Just a photograph on the mantle of a young man in a wetsuit, grinning at a camera. His mother used to tell him one thing. She'd say, "Your daddy died a hero, baby. That's all they'd let me know." And Marcus grew up chasing that word, hero. He put on the same uniform. He earned the same trident. Part of him believed that if he became the man his father was, he'd finally understand what happened to him. But he never got closer. He'd ask around over the years, old-timers, master chiefs, and every time the same thing happened. Their eyes would change, and they'd say they didn't know. So on this particular Thursday, Marcus was doing what he always did, pushing food around a tray he didn't want, one hand resting on Ranger's back, watching the door. The cafeteria was crowded. Wheelchairs and walkers and young men missing pieces of themselves and old men who'd carried their war for 50 years and never set it down. This was his tribe now, the broken and the quiet, and then he heard it, a cane tapping the floor, slow, uneven. Getting closer. Marcus didn't look up at first, but the tapping stopped right at his table, and a voice, thin and worn and steady, said, "Every other seat in this place is taken by a man with 2 good legs. You mind if an old wreck like me sits with the one who won't mind the dog?" Marcus glanced up. An old man stood there leaning hard on a black cane, maybe 80 years old, thin as a fence post. White hair cut close, a faded canvas jacket. His eyes were pale blue, and there was something in them Marcus couldn't name, something patient, like a man who had been waiting a very long time. Marcus waved a hand at the empty chair. "Sit down," he said. "He won't bother you." The old man eased himself into the seat across from Marcus, and it clearly cost him something. He set the cane against the table and let out a long breath. And Ranger, who hadn't lifted his head for a stranger in 2 years, opened one eye and watched him. Marcus went back to his tray. He figured that was that. A shared table, a nod, and then the old man would move on. But the old man didn't make small talk. He just sat there quiet looking at the dog. And after a long moment in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Belgian Malinois, working line, not show. This one's seen the elephant, hasn't he? He's been down range." Marcus stopped chewing. "Yes, sir," he said slowly, "he has." The old man nodded to himself, and something passed over his face that Marcus filed away without understanding. Grief, maybe. "They give everything, dogs like that," the old man said, "and they don't ask for a thing back, just to stay close to their man." He looked up and his pale eyes found Marcus's. "You take good care of him." "I try," Marcus said, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't want the old man to leave. For a while they ate in silence, and it was a comfortable kind. The old man's hands shook when he lifted his coffee. Marcus noticed the way he held it with both hands, careful, like a man who'd learned that spilling things drew attention. That was a soldier's habit. Marcus had it too. "You serve?" Marcus asked. It was the only question that mattered in a place like this. The old man smiled, small and tired. "Long time ago," he said. "Different navy, different world. I was in the water business, you might say." Marcus set down his fork. "The water business." "Boats and beaches," the old man said, waving a hand. "Cold water and bad ideas." He chuckled at some private thing. "We didn't have half the gear you boys have now. We didn't have half the sense either." Marcus watched him more closely now. Even bent and shaking, there was a straightness underneath it. A discipline that 50 years hadn't worn away. "Where'd they send you?" Marcus asked. The old man turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, and then he said, so quietly Marcus almost missed it, "Last real thing I did was off the coast of Somalia, a long time back, a rescue that went bad." He paused. "We lost a good man that day, best I ever knew." Marcus went completely still, because he knew that operation. Not the details, nobody had the details, but the whisper of it. Every man in his old unit had heard it, passed down like a ghost story. An early rescue off the Horn of Africa. A hostage grab gone sideways. A SEAL who'd gone back into the fire alone and hadn't come out. The older guys just called it the day the water burned. "Say that again," Marcus said. His voice had gone low and careful. "Where were you?" The old man looked at him, and whatever he saw in Marcus's face made his own go soft and old and sad. "Somalia," he said. 1996. Marcus's hand tightened on the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. Because 1996 wasn't just a year to him. It was the year on the folded flag. The year his mother stopped talking about the future and started talking about the past. And that's when Ranger rose to his feet. The old dog got up slow, joints and all, and walked around the table. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He pressed the whole side of his body against the old man's leg and looked up at him and let out a low sound that Marcus had never once heard from him. A soft, aching whine. The sound a dog makes when it finds something it lost. The old man reached down with a shaking hand and laid it on Ranger's head, and the dog closed his eyes. Marcus stared. "He doesn't do that," he said. "He doesn't do that with anybody. I've had him 4 years. He doesn't even do that with me." The old man scratched the dog behind the ear, gentle, sure, like a man who had done it 10,000 times. "Dogs remember," he said quietly. "They remember longer than we give them credit for. This line of dog, this exact line. I helped stand up the program that made him, son. A long time ago, before you were born." The cafeteria noise faded into a hum. Marcus felt the hair rise on his arms. And then the old man did something ordinary. He set down his coffee. He folded his napkin. He patted the dog one last time and reached for his cane, like a man getting ready to stand and go, like the whole thing had just been a pleasant lunch between two strangers. "I've kept you long enough," he said with a tired smile. "Thank you for the company and for the seat." He put both hands on the cane and started to push himself up. Marcus exhaled. Part of him thought, that's it, he's just a lonely old vet with a good memory, and I let myself run away with it. The tension in his chest started to loosen. The old man was leaving. It was over. But the old man stopped halfway to standing. He looked down at Ranger, still pressed against his leg, refusing to let him go, and something changed in his face. He sat back down. He reached up with one trembling hand and pushed back the sleeve of his canvas jacket, slow, all the way to the elbow. And there on the thin, spotted skin of his forearm, faded almost to nothing by 50 years of sun and salt, was a tattoo, an eagle, an anchor, and a trident, the mark of a Navy SEAL. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The old man leaned across the table, and in a voice that had gone rough and low, he said one word, a call sign. 2 syllables that Marcus had heard exactly once in his life. From his mother, on the one night she'd let herself drink, when she told him the name the Navy men had used for the man who once pulled his father out of the water and saved his life. "Redfin," the old man said. And the whole room went silent. Not really, the trays still clattered, somewhere a chair scraped. But to Marcus, everything stopped, because his mother had said that name only once and he had held onto it his entire life. Redfin, the man who saved Elias Devereaux, the man who, years before Somalia, had called in the strike that pulled his father off a burning deck. "How do you know that name?" Marcus said. His voice was shaking now. "That's not in any record. That name was never written down. How do you know it?" The old man's pale eyes were wet. "Because it was mine," he said. "Redfin was my call sign. I carried it for 20 years. He took a breath that seemed to cost him everything. And your father's was Longbow, Chief Elias Devereaux. Longbow, say it. You know it." Marcus couldn't speak. His mouth had gone dry. Longbow. It was on a scrap of paper in a box in his closet, his mother's handwriting. He had never said it out loud to another living soul. "You knew my father," Marcus finally managed. "Knew him?" The old man's voice broke. "Son, I was the last man on this earth to hear him speak. I held your father's head in my lap in 3 feet of seawater off the coast of Somalia while the sky came apart around us. I was there the day he died." He stopped. His whole body was trembling now, and it wasn't the age. "And I have been looking for you for 30 years. If you've made it this far, and your throat's a little tight right now, mine is too, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button." Because what this old man said next is the reason he spent 30 years searching, and you're going to want to hear all of it. Marcus gripped the edge of the table with both hands like a man holding onto a raft. Around them, a few people had gone quiet. A young Marine at the next table had turned in his chair. An old woman with a walker had stopped moving. There's a thing that happens in a room full of veterans when they realize they are watching something sacred. They go still. They give it room. "Tell me," Marcus said. "Tell me everything, please." The old man, his name was Tom Havorson, but everyone who mattered had called him Doc, wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and steadied himself. Ranger lay down across his feet, all 90 pounds, and didn't move again. "Your father and I came up together," Doc said. "2 dumb kids from nowhere. He was from Louisiana, talked slow, moved fast. Best swimmer I ever saw, and braver than made any sense. In '89, off a deck in the Gulf, I called in a strike that broke us loose from an ambush. Pulled your dad out of a fire with a rope and a prayer. That's the day he started calling me Redfin like it was my Christian name. Said I saved his life. Said he owed me one." Doc's jaw tightened. "I told him he didn't owe me a thing. Turned out I was wrong. He paid it back with interest." Marcus didn't move. He was afraid that if he moved, the old man would stop. 1996, Doc went on. We got the call in the middle of the night. Aid workers taken off the Somali coast. A doctor, 2 nurses, and a little girl. Bad men, worse place. They sent us in off a small boat, quiet, no lights. He paused. Your father almost didn't go. Why? Marcus whispered. Doc looked at him for a long moment. Because that same morning before we launched, a message came through from stateside. Your mother had gone into labor early, and by the time we were kidding up, another message came. It was a boy, healthy, 7 pounds. The old man's eyes filled. You, son, you were born that morning, half a world away. And your father found out he was a daddy about 4 hours before we hit that beach. Marcus's eyes went hot. He blinked hard. He knew, he said. He knew I was born. He knew, Doc said, and now the tears ran down the deep lines of his face and he didn't wipe them. You want to know what he did? He didn't celebrate, he got quiet. He took me aside, handed me a folded up letter and said, Doc, if I don't make it back off this rock, you make sure my boy gets this. You put it in his hand yourself, promise me. Doc's voice cracked all the way through. And I laughed at him. God forgive me, I laughed. I said, Longbow, you're gonna hand it to him yourself, and bore that kid to tears with it. And he just looked at me, and he said, promise me anyway. So I did. The old man reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely work the button, and he drew out an envelope, old, soft as cloth, yellowed and worn at the folds from 30 years of being carried close to a man's heart. On the front, in faded pencil in the hand of a man who died before his son could read, were 3 words, to my son. Doc laid it on the table between them and could not let go of it. His fingers stayed pressed against the paper. The rescue went bad from the first minute, he said, staring at the envelope. They knew we were coming. Muzzle flashes all along the tree line. We got the hostages moving toward the water, but the little girl, she froze, wouldn't run. Just stood there in the open with the rounds cracking past her, and your father didn't even stop to think. He went back, straight into it. He picked up that little girl and put his own body between her and the guns, and he ran her all the way down to the surf and handed her off to me. Doc squeezed his eyes shut. And that's when he got hit. Marcus made a sound low in his chest. He couldn't help it. I got him into the water, Doc said, behind the boat where the rounds couldn't reach. I had my hands on the wound. I was doing everything, telling him he was fine, we were going home. The tears were falling freely now off the end of the old man's chin. But he knew. They always know. He grabbed my collar. He pulled me down. And over all that noise, do you know what your father said to me? Marcus shook his head. He said, did she make it? The little girl, did she make it? Doc pressed a fist to his mouth. That was his first question, dying in my arms, and his first thought was for somebody else's child. He looked up at Marcus. I told him yes. I told him she was safe on the boat, and he smiled. And then he said, tell my boy his daddy tried to come home. Tell him I was thinking about him at the end. Tell him. Doc stopped. He couldn't get it out. The whole corner of the cafeteria was silent now. The young Marine had his hand over his mouth. 2 old vets at the next table had taken off their caps and were holding them against their chests, the way men do at a graveside. Tell him what, Marcus said, and his voice was barely there. Please, tell me what he said. Doc reached across the table and put his old, shaking hand over Marcus's. He said, tell my boy I already love him more than my own life, and I proved it. Make sure he knows I proved it. The old man's grip tightened. Those were the last words your father ever spoke, and then he was gone. Held that little girl's life more precious than his own. Held yours more precious than anything on this earth. And he never got to see your face. Marcus Devereaux, decorated Navy SEAL, a man who had not cried in front of another human being since he was a boy, put his head down on the table in a crowded VA cafeteria and wept. His shoulders shook. Ranger got up and pressed against his side, then leaned back against Doc, holding onto both of them at once, the way that Dog had somehow known to do from the moment the old man walked in. Doc held Marcus's hand the whole time. He didn't say anything. He just let the boy grieve the father he'd been grieving his whole life, without ever having the pieces to do it right. "Why," Marcus finally said, lifting his head, his face wet and raw. "Why did it take 30 years? You had his letter. Why didn't you find me sooner?" The old man's face crumpled. "Because I couldn't, son. God knows I tried. When we got home, everything about that op got buried, classified so deep the paperwork disappeared. I wasn't even allowed to tell your mother how it really happened. I went to the funeral in the back of the church and I couldn't say a word to her. They'd have court-martialed me. And then your family moved. No forwarding address. I looked for years. I wrote letters that came back. I hired a man once, spent money I didn't have." His voice dropped. "And then I got old, Marcus. My mind started slipping. My legs went. I put your father's letter in my pocket every single morning for 30 years, and every morning I told him, 'Not today, old friend, but I haven't given up.' A promise to a dying man is the only kind that never expires." He looked at the trident on his own thin arm, then at the one he knew was on Marcus's. 3 weeks ago I heard there was a Devereaux out of the teams coming through the Norfolk VA," he said. "Young, big, came home with a war dog, and I thought, Lord, after all this time, don't let me be too late." His voice broke. "I've come here every Thursday for 3 weeks, son, waiting, praying it was you. And then that dog stood up and walked across the room and put his head on my leg like he'd known me his whole life." Doc laughed through his tears. "And I knew. Because those dogs, that line, I helped raise the first of them. Your dad and I named the program together. We called it after him." He looked down at Ranger. "Longbow Kennels. Your daddy's the reason this dog exists, and that dog just brought you home to me." Marcus looked down at Ranger, then at the old man, then at the soft, yellowed envelope on the table with his name on it in his father's own hand. For a long moment he couldn't touch it. His whole life had been a locked door, and here was the key, and he was afraid of what was on the other side. Doc understood. He slid the envelope the last few inches across the table until it touched Marcus's fingers. "He wrote it for you," Doc said gently. "It's yours. It's been yours for 30 years. I was just the mailman." Marcus picked it up. His hands that had held a rifle steady under fire, could not hold this steady at all. He opened it carefully, the way you open something that can't be replaced. Inside was a single sheet, folded in 3, the ink gone soft and brown. He read it silently. His lips moved, but no sound came. And then, because Doc reached over and squeezed his arm, because his father's words deserved to be spoken out loud after 30 years in the dark, Marcus read it to him in a broken whisper. "To my son, I don't know your name yet. Your mama and I couldn't agree, so I guess by the time you read this, you'll know it better than me. I'm sorry I'm not there. If you're reading this, it means I did my job and it cost me the only thing I ever really wanted, which was to hold you one time. I want you to know something, and I want you to carry it your whole life. You were not an accident and you were not a burden. You were the thing I was fighting to get home to. Every hard mile I ever walked, I walked so that boys like you could grow up soft and safe and never know what it costs. Be gentle, son. The world's got plenty of hard men. Be the kind that carries other people. That's the only strength that ever meant a thing. I love you already. I loved you before I ever saw you. Your daddy, Elias." Marcus lowered the letter, and for a moment, nobody in that corner of the room said anything at all. Then the old Marine at the next table stood up, slowly, painfully, on a bad hip, and he brought his hand up in a salute. And one by one, All through that cafeteria, old men and young men rose from their chairs. The ones who could stand stood. The ones who couldn't sat up straight, and they held their salute for a father they never knew, for a promise 30 years in the keeping, and for a son who had finally come home. Marcus folded the letter with more care than he'd ever handled anything. He put it against his own chest over his heart, the same place the old man had carried it for 3 decades. Then he looked at Doc Halvorson, this frail, limping stranger who had walked in on a cane and turned out to be the last living thread between Marcus and the father he'd spent his whole life chasing. "You kept your promise," Marcus said. "I kept my promise," Doc said. And he sagged in his chair, and something went out of his shoulders, some great weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. 30 years, son. I can finally tell him it's done." Marcus stood. He came around the table, and he did the thing his father never got to do. He put his arms around the old man gently, mindful of how thin he'd become, and he held him. Doc's hands gripped the back of Marcus's shirt, and he shook, and the two of them stood there in the middle of that crowded room, holding on. They didn't rush after that. Marcus got the old man a fresh cup of coffee, and they sat back down, and Doc told him the good stories, the ones that had no guns in them. How Elias couldn't carry a tune but sang anyway. How he wrote his wife a letter every single day, even the days nothing happened. How he kept a photo of an ultrasound taped inside his helmet and showed it to anyone who'd look. Marcus laughed for the first time in longer than he could remember. It felt strange in his chest, like using a muscle that had gone to sleep. Doc told him about Longbow Kennels, too. How the program was real, still running, and how every dog that came out of it traced back to the first litter he and Elias had picked out together 30 years ago. Ranger was part of that line. Which meant, in a way neither of them could fully explain, the dog lying across their feet was the last living thing that connected them. Elias to Doc, and Doc to Marcus, all through one graying Belgian Malinois who'd stood up in a crowded room and refused to leave a stranger's side. "He knew," Doc said, looking down at the dog. "Somehow he knew what I was carrying. They always know what we can't say." Marcus didn't drive home right away. He and Doc sat there until the lunch crowd thinned and the staff started stacking chairs. 2 men and a tired old dog, in no hurry to break something that had taken 30 years to build. Before they left, Marcus asked the old man where he was staying. Doc admitted, a little embarrassed, that he was in a room at a VA residence across town alone with no family left. His wife was gone. They'd never had children of their own. It had just been him and the promise for a long, long time. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You know that program my father named? Longbow. I've got nothing but time now. And I've got a dog who apparently answers to you. I think somebody ought to help those kennels train the next generation. Somebody who knew the man it's named for." Doc's pale eyes filled again. "Son, I'm 81 years old with one working leg." "You don't need to run," Marcus said quietly. "You just need to sit in a chair and tell those young handlers about the man who started it, about what these dogs are for. I'll drive you. Every Thursday, and every other day too if you want the company." The old man couldn't speak. He just nodded over and over, one shaking hand pressed to his mouth. So that's what they did. Every Thursday, and then most days, a big quiet Navy SEAL and a frail old man on a cane and a graying war dog would show up at Longbow Kennels, and the young handlers would gather around, and Doc would tell them about a slow-talking, fast-moving kid from Louisiana who ran back into the fire for a little girl he'd never met and thought of his newborn son at the very end. Marcus framed the letter. He hung it on the wall by his front door, where he'd see it every time he left the house and every time he came home. Be the kind that carries other people. That's the only strength that ever meant a thing. He read it every morning. Some mornings it still put a lump in his throat, Most mornings it just steadied him, the way a father's voice is supposed to. And Doc lived 3 more years. Good ones. He got to be a grandfather without ever being a father. Spoiled Marcus Rotten came to holidays, sat in the best chair. When he passed in his sleep, and they found him with his hand resting on the collar of a photograph of the first Longbow dog. Marcus stood up at the funeral, the way Doc had never been allowed to stand up at his father's, and he told the whole church exactly what the old man had done, the promise he'd kept for 30 years, and the 2 families he'd carried across a lifetime to finally lay a good man's words in his son's hand. At the very end, Marcus said this. He said his father had been wrong about one thing. Elias thought his son would grow up soft and safe and never know what it cost. But Marcus did know now. He knew exactly what it cost, and who paid it, and how long a good man will carry a promise if you ask him to. And then he looked down at the front row, where an old dog lay across an empty chair, gray in the face, refusing to leave the spot where his friend used to sit. Just like the first day. A dog who remembered longer than anyone gave him credit for. Nobody said a word. The room just went quiet, and Marcus, at last, was not alone in it. That comes to roughly 4,990 words inside your 4,805,200 window. The cuts came from the setup and Doc's dialogue, doubled phrases like a story that ended, or the memory of it, and a few redundant tags. With the hook, the letter, the salute, and the full 3 years later resolution kept word for word.